England, Manchester North, 36, Low Lilac Street. Mrs. Brown has just woken up. She has left her room and walked upstairs along the wooden handrail stairs. She is a charming middle-aged woman with a dark brownish. His hair was pulled loosely behind his head, his white skin was almost transparent, his eyes were black, with a little crow's feet at the corners of his eyes. He was wearing a silk nightdress with white sleeves and a pair of pure white wool slippers on his feet. The purpose of her trip was to wake up her 2 children who lived upstairs. The largest window by the stairs was covered by thick curtains, and the whole second floor looked very dark. As Mrs. Brown walked up, she took out a short brown stick from the hem pocket of her nightgown, and held the larger end in her hand, apparently too old and paler than the other of many. She waved the stick in her hand gently, and muttered something. The thick curtain magically opened by herself, and the chain buckle on the window lattice automatically closed the curtain. In an instant, the sun shines through the window to brighten the entire corridor, and a little dust drifts away from the beam of light. Mrs. Brown went up to the second floor, walked to the 2 opposite milky white wooden doors, knocked gently on the 2 doors with each hand, and said kindly, "Get up, my dears, today is a special day. I think you don't want to miss such an important event." Obviously, the person behind the door on the right felt like he was waiting for Mrs. Brown to knock on the door. She slammed the door open, jumped into Mrs. Brown's arms, and kissed her cheek affectionately. Mrs. Brown also kissed her dotingly. Holding the little man in his arms, the little man has long blonde hair, a little pink on his fair skin, an excited light in his big blue eyes. She happily greets Mrs. Brown. "Good morning, Mother. Have you written a letter?" At this moment, the door on the right also opened, and a little boy with black hair came out. From his hair color to his facial features, it was as if he had been carved out of the same mold as Mrs. Brown. At this time, the little boy was frowning and looking at Mrs. Brown girl in dissatisfied tone. "Chien, how many times have I said it? Be calm and don't be frizzy about everything." The blonde-haired elf complained to Mrs. Brown with an aggrieved face. "Mom, look at Austin. He didn't say hello to you in the morning, but he blamed me first." Mrs. Brown also shook her head and looked helpless. She squatted down and gently put down the little girl, then pulled the little boy to her side, kissed his forehead, and persuaded, all right, Austin, you are the elder brother, let the younger sister be a little bit." The little blonde girl winked mischievously at him. The little boy named Austin also gave her a roll of eyes. Mrs. Brown put their facial expressions in her eyes and smiled helplessly. She gently stroked Austin's sleepy black hair and said softly, "And what an important day today is, OS, don't you look forward to it at all?" Austin's frowning brows still remained, he shook his head helplessly and said, "Mom, I'll bet that there will never be a second letter today, are you still holding out hope?" Mrs. Brown sighed softly, increased strength in her hands, and rubbed Austin's hair. "Oh, children, don't look down on yourself so much, and I'm talking about another thing, today is your 11th birthday, dear children, happy birthday." Austin finally relaxed his brows, smiled, and said a little embarrassedly, "Thank you, Mom." The blonde elf Sissy also came over and hugged Mrs. Orang. "OS told me yesterday that when my mother gave birth to us 11 years ago, it was the most dangerous and painful time in a woman's life. Thank you, Mother, I love you." There were tears in Mrs. Brown's eyes. She kissed their cheeks one by one and said movingly, "Babies, I love you too. Today, 11 years ago, I had you, and it was my happiest moment." The mother and son were tired of being together for a while, before Mrs. Brown dragged one downstairs. As soon as they descended the stairs, they saw Mr. Brown not far away. The bright sunlight outside through the living room window shone on his short blonde hair, making his whole person extremely dark. He was sitting on the sofa in his pajamas at the moment, looking at the coffee table in a trance. Mrs. Brown jokingly took a few quick steps. "Morning, Alger, why haven't you gone to work yet? I don't remember your office also having summer vacations." Mr. Brown raised his head, his blue eyes exactly like Sissy were full of excitement. This month's financial report has come out. Now the office is not so busy. I just asked for a week's leave. Mrs. Brown frowned, obviously dissatisfied with his style of asking for leave when he asked for leave, just about to say something. Mr. Brown interrupted her immediately. More than anything else, Daisy, look at this one. Saying that, he stood up, stretched out his hand and pulled Mrs. Brown to his side, pointing to something on the coffee table for her to see. The little blonde beauty behind her also hurriedly followed, for fear of missing something interesting. Austin looked helpless and paced behind him unhurriedly. He was really used to seeing his father make a fuss, and every time his kind mother always looked at her stupid husband with a gentle look on her face. That little guy, Chien, even made a surprised expression every time her father made a joke, so that she could buy it. It made Austin feel as if he was a normal person at home. This time, it was different. Yu reading www.yuyuganshu.com. As the distance between him and the coffee table gradually shortened, the things on the table came into his sight little by little. There was a cup of coffee that Mr. Brown brewed for himself early in the morning, and there was a curly heat. A&D. 2 strange letters. Austin was stunned. He looked up at his family in astonishment. Mr. Brown looked relieved. Mrs. Brown and Sissy both had the same surprised faces. Then Sissy jumped up excitedly and hit her mother. With a palm, he rushed over to hug Austin, shouting excitedly, "I knew it! I knew it! OS, you won't be a squib! Look! Here's the proof! 2 letters!" Austin came back to his senses, and gently, like catching a chicken, pulled Sissy off his body, frowned and said, "Miss Sissy, don't get too excited, things are still unclear, so you can't draw conclusions so early. Also, please pay attention to your wording, I prefer to be called the descendant of wizards who don't know magic, rather than the insulting one." Words. Still being carried by Austin, Sissy, who had just tapped on the ground with her toes, gave him a big white eye. Austin put her down and looked at her parents reproachfully. "This is another prank of my father. Let my mother change the envelope back. I think it's good to have no magic. It's not bad to be an ordinary person. Dad, don't you have such a high salary every month? I'm going to prepare later. Be an accountant like you too. I can have a happy birthday without this letter. I don't want to be in that world. Although the man who can't be named is temporarily down, who knows when he'll make a comeback. There are still a lot of potential dangers in the wizarding world, and I don't agree with where Sissy goes. It's better to go to Beaux Batons, it's far away, but it's not dangerous." When he had finished speaking at length, Mr. Brown and Mrs. Brown looked at each other. "What are you talking about, OSS, I don't understand?" Mr. Brown asked. Austin shook his head and sighed, "Oh, I mean, this must have been created by your mother's magic. Get it back quickly. Don't make such a joke on such an important day." The Browns understood now. They looked at each other and smiled. Mrs. Brown walked up to Austin, squatted down, she stroked Austin's short black hair lightly, her blue eyes looked into his, and said kindly, "Baby, I assure you, I didn't use any magic." Austin looked at his mother with puzzled eyes, then glanced at the 2 letters on the table, and suddenly understood, "You mean, one of these is mine?" "Yeah." Mrs. Brown nodded heavily. Mr. Brown also picked up the coffee on the table with ease, put his other hand towards Austin, blinked at the letter on the table and asked, "Would you like to take a look at it?" After listening to her father's words, Chien Elf ran to the coffee table, grabbed the letter with her name on it, and read it first. Austin also picked up another letter and examined it carefully. It was a pale yellow envelope with emerald green ink on it, England, Manchester North, 36 Low Lilac Street, left-hand room on the 2nd floor, received by Mr. Alston Brown. "God, they even know which room I live in." Chien raised her head and stared at her brother with wide blue eyes. Austen glanced at her envelope, and sure enough, the only difference from his letter was that the room on the left became the room on the right, and Austen Brown became Sissy Brown. Austen smiled and shook his head, disdainfully saying, "Tricks to fool children." Mrs. Brown and Mr. Brown, who had been watching Austen's reaction, looked at each other with a little deep meaning in their eyes. Austen picked up the envelope knife beside the dining table, opened the letter, and took out the letter inside. Sure enough, it was the same as what he had seen in the book. It was written in the same emerald green ink: Headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Albus Dumbledore, President of the International Federation of Magic, President of the Wizarding Association, First Class Wizard of the Merlin Order. Dear Mr. Brown, we are pleased to inform you that you have been admitted to study at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Enclosed is a list of required books and equipment. The semester is scheduled to start on September 1st. We will be waiting for your reply from your owl by July 31st. Vice Principal, Female, Minerva McGonagall. Sincerely. On another sheet of paper is a list of school supplies, written in the same font. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry uniform. First year freshmen need 1. 3 sets of plain work gowns, black. 2. A plain pointed hat, black, for day wear. 3. A pair of protective gloves, made of dragon skin or similar materials. 4. 1 winter cape, black, silver buckle. Please note, all student clothing must be marked with a name tag. Textbook. All students are required to prepare the following books: Standard Spells, Beginner by Miranda Goshawk, History of Magic by Bathilda Bagshot, Theory of Magic by Adbel Wallen, The Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration by Emrys Witch, 1,000 Magical Herbs and Mushrooms by Phil Lidda's Pole, Magic Potions and Potions by Arsenal Geiger, Monsters and Where They Found by Newt Scamander. The Dark Forces, A Guide to Self-Defense by Quentin Tring. Other equipment: a magic wand, a crucible, made of pewter, standard size number 2, a set of glass or crystal vials, a telescope, a brass balance. Students may bring an owl or a cat or a toad. I would like to draw the attention of parents here, first year students are not allowed to bring their own brooms. Austen read the letter quickly, feeling very complicated. And the little guy on the other side, Sissy, also finished reading the letter and was extremely happy. Her originally fair little face was flushed, and she jumped up and down with excitement, shouting, "Dad! I'm going to Hogwarts!" Soon she jumped to Mrs. Brown's side again, happily pulling the sleeve of Mrs. Brown's pajamas and saying, "Mom! I'm going to Hogwarts to learn magic." Mrs. Brown also bent down, stroked the little guy's blonde hair, and nodded with a doting smile. Austen looked at the scene in front of him and showed a gratified smile. After all, this little guy is so looking forward to it. Since their 10th birthdays at the same time, she has knocked on Austen's door almost every day before going to bed and asked him expectantly, "Do you think I'll get a letter from Hogwarts tomorrow morning?" And Austen could only laugh helplessly and drive her out every time, repeating the same cookie-cutter saying, "Sissy, how many times have I said it? Only 11-year-old wizards can receive letters, you are only 10 years old, go to bed now." Sissy, who was kicked out, could only roll her eyes at Austen's door and return to her own little bed, dreaming sweet dreams. Now the dream has come true, and Austen is really happy for his twin sister. However, he looked down at the letter in his hand again, and the complicated mood surfaced again. Mr. Brown, who was looking at Sissy's mother and daughter happily, also noticed Austen's strangeness. He walked over carefully, patted Austen's tender shoulder, and deliberately joked, "What's wrong, Austen? I can't speak in surprise? It's not like you." Austen stroked his hair indiscriminately, let out a long sigh of relief, and shoved the letter in his hand to Mr. Brown. "Dad, I'm tired. I want to be alone." After speaking, he turned around and walked up the stairs to the second floor, leaving Mr. Brown holding the letter and staring blankly at Austen's back. Mrs. Brown, who was holding Sissy, congratulated her daughter and also had a panoramic view of the exchange between the father and son. She carried Chien to her husband and patted his shoulder lightly. Mr. Brown turned his head slightly, looked at Mrs. Brown and said, "Daisy, I feel that Austin was not as happy as I thought when he received this letter." The disappointment in his dark eyes made Mrs. Brown feel distressed. She comforted Mr. Brown gently and said, "Alger, he is still a child, it is too sudden for him to hear such news, you should give it takes time for him to accept that fact." I know, Daisy, but I'm afraid, you know, I've been a squib for more than 30 years, and in the more than 10 years when Austin had no magic fluctuations at all, I almost accepted that my son is a harmonious. The fact that I'm a squib now has hope, but seeing how he can't be happy at all, I'm really afraid that he will refuse. Daisy, I really don't want him to live a life away from magic and family like me." "Days!" Mr. Brown said angrily. Mrs. Brown put down Sissy, gently arranged the collar of her pajamas for her husband, put her hand on his chest, and continued to persuade her husband. "Alger, you know, Austin is a smart child. He has been more mature than other children since he was a child, and this time too, he will not disappoint us." After Austin went upstairs, he turned his head and entered his room. The curtains in the room had not been drawn, and it was dark inside. The desk and bookshelf on the left, and the wardrobe on the right were vaguely visible. In the center of the room was a large bed. He suddenly threw himself onto the bed, sighing and staring at the ceiling in a trance. Ever since he first came to this world 11 years ago, Mrs. Brown lying on the bed waved the little wooden stick in her hand, and he and his sister's cradle flew in front of her. He knew where he was, because he knew where he was. "In my childhood, I loved those 7 novels so much, and I was so eager for this world." After a tragic accident as an adult, he actually came into the world. However, what is frustrating is that in the past 11 years, facing the twin sisters' stronger magic fluctuations, he gradually realized the fact that he has no magic talent. Maybe it's because he's from a different world, maybe it's because his father was a squib who didn't know magic. Although Mr. Brown is a squib, the excellence of a person is not necessarily judged by the level of magic. Austin doesn't know how Mr. Brown's boyhood lived, but apparently, Mr. Brown has successfully integrated into the Muggle world. He attended Muggle schools, learned Muggle knowledge, rode Muggle transport, did Muggle jobs. Just from the fact that he graduated from Harrow School and Cambridge University, and then entered KPMG as an accountant, a series of resumes that many Muggles could not complete. In the past 10 years, he was recognized as a squib by the whole family, and he gradually became disgusted with the magical world. Mrs. Brown was afraid of hurting his heart, so she seldom used magic in front of him. He also began to plan for the future. Maybe he could get into the unreachable Harrow School with hard work, and then follow in his father's footsteps and become the greatest accountant in the 20th century. It is also a very good choice. Now, a letter has messed up everything, and his mood has begun to become complicated. To be honest, he really wants to refuse. On the one hand, he has no magical fluctuations, and he is probably the worst student at Hogwarts. On the one hand, after all, even if he did enter that magical world, it would not be so secure. A few years later, the terrifying Dark Lord would re-emerge again, so it was unlikely that a small character like him would accidentally become cannon fodder. Thinking of this, he faintly began to worry about his younger sister, whose magical power fluctuated stronger day by day. He even suggested several times to his parents that Sissy should go to Beaux Batons in France to study in the future, in order to avoid this catastrophe. Now, not only his sister can't run away, but even he himself is involved. Looking at the eager eyes and happy faces of his parents, he can't say anything if he refuses. There was a knock at the door of Cow Cow. "OSS, can I come in?" Mr. Brown's heavy voice came in. Austin sat up and said, "Please come in." Mr. Brown gently pushed open the door, holding a flat package in his hand, walked to Austin's bed and sat beside him. He handed the package to Austin and said, "Birthday, baby." Austin's expression improved a little. He thanked his father and opened the beautiful box little by little. Inside was a straw yellow hard straw hat. He took out the straw hat and looked at his father in surprise. Mr. Brown answered his question with a longing look on his face. This is the straw hat I wore when I was at Harrow School. It was a wonderful time. I know Harrow School is also your dream. I wanted to wait for you when you were 13 years old. I gave it to you again. I'm afraid it won't be used now. Dad, I don't really want to. Austin was about to retort while holding his straw hat. Mr. Brown raised his hand to interrupt him, and then gave him a playful wink and suggested, "OSS, do you want to hear my story?" Mr. and Mrs. Brown never told the Austen brothers and sisters about their past. The brothers and sisters gradually realized that it might not be such a happy memory as they became sensible, so they never dared to dig deeper. Austen looked at his father worriedly and said, "Dad, you don't have to do it for me." Mr. Brown spoke as if he hadn't heard him. "Your mother and I are from different magical families, and we grew up together. I have 2 older sisters and a younger brother, and the 4 of us have always been close to each other. My older sisters will receive it as soon as they are 11 years old. The letter from Hogwarts, and then after half a year, when I came back, I brought a lot of fun and funny things for me and your uncle. Gradually I turned 11, and I was waiting for my 11th birthday. The letter from Hogwarts, and I also promised my brother that I would bring back all the fun things at Hogwarts. But that birthday that made me look forward to it seems to have been as deep in my life as it was yesterday." Deep imprint. Austen gently shook his father's big hand. Father also patted him lightly, and then said later, "My brother also turned 11 and received a letter from Hogwarts without incident. I always thought they must have made a mistake. Our Brown family never had a squib, so I used your grandfather's. Owl sent a letter to Dumbledore, the headmaster of Hogwarts, expressing my doubts. I received a reply very quickly. Dumbledore's words were very euphemistic, but also told me that a quill cannot go wrong. I didn't have my name on the Hogwarts roster to begin with." Mr. Brown lowered his head and stared into Austen's eyes. There were waves in his clear blue eyes, and he went on to say later, "I finally gave up. My parents, sister, and brother treated me as always, even more friendly, but over time they couldn't stand the pressure of the family and the condemnation of relatives. You know, squibs can't live in the wizarding world. So they sent me to a pair of old Muggle childless homes in Manchester, changed their memories, made them believe I was their son, and that was the last thing my parents could do for me. After that, I lived an ordinary Muggle life. Your mother would secretly come to accompany me every time she was on vacation, and only this time was my happiest time." Austen could see from his father's face how happy he was in those days. "Your mother belongs to the Black family. She and I were called Daisy Black before we got married. Of course, don't take too much favor. That family is full of dark wizards." Mr. Brown waved his hand and explained to Austen. "After she graduated from Hogwarts, she married me without hesitation, and the Black family also removed her from the name because of my relationship. My adoptive parents died shortly after our marriage. I was in college at the time. During that time, it was thanks to your mother who stayed with me, helped me to take care of the housework, and also gave my adoptive parents a decent funeral. You and Chien will be born in a few years. You are the best gift from God. Good gift." After that, every once in a while, Sissy always has to blow up something, which makes me happy and a headache, and you are so quiet. I am afraid you are like me, a squib without magic. Now a letter like this overturns my assumption. Dad knows your worries, and I'm afraid you won't fit in there. Living in the Muggle world is a simple thing. I hope you can fulfill the dream that I can't fulfill. Simple, leave it to me to do." Austen read through his father's eyes what a surprise it was for Mr. Brown that he received the notice. He took a deep breath and nodded heavily. "Okay, Dad, I will try my best to be a good leader. You're proud wizard." Mr. Brown touched his son's head with relief, and took his hand downstairs. Downstairs, the mother and daughter were sitting on the sofa and writing a reply. At this moment, seeing the Brown father and son walking over with smiles on their faces, Mrs. Brown was relieved. Sissy ran to Austen and handed over a piece of paper and said, "Well, let's reply together." Austen took it over politely, sitting on the sofa and writing quickly. He first expressed his gratitude for the admission to Hogwarts in the letter, and then euphemistically expressed the doubts in his heart. Soon the 2 letters were written, and Mrs. Brown called the owl and gave it a piece of cheesecake she had prepared in the morning, then tied the 2 letters to its legs, followed her feathers and said, "Go on." The owl flew away facing the rising sun. Predictably, Dumbledore's letter came very quickly. Early the next morning, Austen saw the owl that his mother released yesterday. He quickly removed the parchment from the owl's legs and read it. The above is Dumbledore's peculiar slender font with circles and circles. As he imagined, it clearly stated that there was no mistake, and Austen was the student that Hogwarts was going to admit. This gave Austen a sigh of relief. After all, when he went to Hogwarts, there was no reason for them to kick him out of the school because he had no magic power. The next morning, the Browns got up early. Austen had never woken up so early. Sissy was looking for shoes, and Mr. Brown was looking for socks. As for Austen, he got up and put on his clothes, and walked downstairs, only to fall asleep again sitting between the coffee table and the sofa. Mrs. Brown just picked up Austen and went upstairs to help Sissy find shoes. Mr. Brown came out of the bedroom with different socks on his feet. He raised his head and shouted upstairs, "Honey, where are my black vertical striped socks?" Mrs. Brown waved her wand and shouted, "Shoes flying," and responded angrily, "Go to the drawer under the closet and get a new pair, we don't have time." After the family was ready, Austen finally came to his senses. The family of 4 drove to the railway station. Mr. Brown bought 4 train tickets to London at the ticket booth. On the train Mr. Brown cleared his throat and said to them, "Today we're going to buy you school supplies. When we get to London, we'll go to the Leaky Cauldron, and then go from the back arch to Diagon Alley, the busiest street market in London, where we can buy everything we want. Arrive." After listening to Mr. Brown's words, a middle-aged man with a big belly next to him made a nasal sound and looked at their family of 4 playfully. Mrs. Brown, who was holding Sissy in her arms, glared at Mr. Brown with a frown and whispered, "Keep your voice down, Alger." Only then did Mr. Brown realize that something was wrong, and he lowered his voice and continued to speak. "There are pets on the item list. First, think about what kind of pets you want. Dad can sell them to you." After hearing this, Chien, who was sleepy in her mother's arms, immediately regained her energy, and her eyes almost lit up. This made Mrs. Brown angrily reprimanded. At the end of the long journey, they arrived at King's Cross station without stopping. Mr. Brown hurriedly took them a taxi and went straight to the Leaky Cauldron. The taxi stopped in front of a big bookstore, and a few people got out of the car. Mr. Brown took Austen's hand, and Mrs. Brown held Sissy. The couple looked around nervously for a few times. Enter a small door next to the bookstore. This is the Leaky Cauldron, which seems to have used some kind of magic to keep the Muggles from noticing it. The inside was dilapidated and dimly lit, which made Austen, who had just experienced the August sun in London, feel pitch dark as soon as he entered the Leaky Cauldron. It took a while for Austen's eyes to relax, and he gradually saw the things in the bar. A few musty tables were randomly placed in the center, and a few people sat beside the table, holding wine glasses in their hands to chat. On the sky, Mr. Brown took a few steps and shook hands with the man behind the bar. The man had a shriveled walnut-like face and a terrifying smile. Mr. Brown introduced his children to him. Austen knew that this man was Tom, the owner of the Leaky Cauldron. He was as ugly as the book said. Austen shook hands with him without disdain. However, Chien buried her face in her mother's arms and did not raise her head when she was beaten to death. Tom had to smile awkwardly. The family of 4 sat in front of the bar. Mr. Brown ordered 4 glasses of butterbeer. While drinking the beer, he looked around. Suddenly, he was stunned and exclaimed, "Merlin's beard, I never thought I would meet her here." Austen, who was not used to beer with cream, was struggling with his taste buds. He listened to his father's sigh and followed the sound. Not far away stood a middle-aged woman with blonde hair, followed by a few others. The red-haired children, while Austin guessed their identities, apparently also noticed them by middle-aged women. The middle-aged woman walked to the bar quickly with her children, shouting excitedly as she walked. "Oh my god, you reading www.uuganshu.com Alger, you're here too, I didn't expect to meet you here." Walking to the bar, she gently hugged Mrs. Brown again and greeted, "Daisy, you are here too, we haven't seen each other for a long time." Mrs. Brown smiled kindly and replied, "Yes, I haven't seen each other since graduation. It's been almost 20 years. After the greeting, the middle-aged woman looked at Austin and Sissy with a face full of butter beer cream with a puzzled look. "Are you, come to Diagon Alley to buy something?" Hearing this, Mr. Brown's voice was obviously an octave higher, and he said proudly, "Yes, the children received a notice from Hogwarts the day before yesterday, so we came here. After all, it's better to choose carefully earlier." After speaking, Mr. Brown introduced to the two children. "This is my distant cousin, Molly." Mr. Brown suddenly got stuck and looked at the middle-aged woman with questioning eyes. The Weasley middle-aged woman took over. "Oh. Yes, that's right, Aunt Molly Weasley." Mr. Brown looked up embarrassedly again and said to Molly, "I'm so sorry Molly, we didn't even attend your wedding." "It's okay, Alger, after all, the circumstances were special at that time, didn't I also attend your wedding?" Mrs. Weasley smiled kindly. Austin stared closely at Mrs. Weasley's children. After seeing them, he had a vague guess. He didn't expect that his family was actually related to the Weasleys. The two identical boys were obviously Fred Weasley and George Weasley, and the boy with long arms and legs next to him is definitely Ron in the trio. Another little girl with freckles that is a little smaller than Sissy is probably Harry Potter's future wife Ginny Weasley. While Austin looked at the children, the other side was also looking at their siblings. Mrs. Weasley pointed to the red-haired children and said, "They are my children, this is George, this is Fred, and they are twins who are in second year at Hogwarts this year. This is Ron, who has just received a letter from Hogwarts." He pointed to the youngest red-haired girl and said, "She is Ginny, my youngest daughter." After she finished speaking, she looked at Austin and Sissy, raised her head and asked Mrs. Brown, "Are you twins too?" Mrs. Brown replied with a smile, "Yes, the older one is the elder brother, called Austin, and the younger one is the younger sister, called Sissy." Mrs. Weasley approached and hugged Sissy kindly. "What a beautiful boy, you inherited all the beautiful things from the Brown family, beautiful blonde hair and blue eyes." Chien shyly said thanks. The three Weasley boys were all staring at Sissy, looking at her embarrassedly. Austin pulled Sissy behind him and stared back ill-naturedly. Several boys also died down and shriveled. Mrs. Brown took Mrs. Weasley's hand and chatted about the home. She asked, "Why don't you see your husband?" "Oh, our third son needs a new wand, and his dad took him to buy it." Mrs. Brown expressed her doubts. "Third son, God, Molly, how many children do you have?" Mrs. Weasley said embarrassedly, grabbing the corner of her clothes. "There are 2 sons, the eldest and the second have graduated." "My God, 7 children, it's really hard work." Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Weasley continued to chat, but Sissy couldn't sit still. She tugged at Dad's shirt and whispered, "Dad, let's go, there are still a lot of things to buy." Mr. Brown looked at the watch on his wrist, and after drinking the remaining butterbeer in the glass, he interrupted the 2 ladies who were chatting hotly. "I'm sorry, although it's not a gentleman's way to interrupt the 2 ladies who are chatting hot, but I'm really sorry, we don't have time for Daisy." Mrs. Brown also apologized, then dragged their siblings to the back of the leaky cauldron. The 3 little boys still followed Sissy back. Reaching the back wall of the leaky cauldron, Mrs. Brown took out her wand and tapped 3 times on a brick above the trash can. After a while, the brick she tapped shook, and the other bricks centered on that brick also moved quickly. And before them an archway appeared before them, leading to a winding, cobbled street with no end in sight. There are all kinds of strange shops on both sides of the road, with moving signs that have been enchanted, and people come and go on the street. All of them are people wearing various cloaks, and there are many of them who are dressed normally like the Brown family. Austen guessed that most of them were muggles who had children at home and received notices, because their eyes were so busy that they could not wait to fly to various shops. Obviously it was their first time here. After the arches, Mr. Brown quipped, "Welcome to Diagon Alley." When Chien saw the scene in front of her, her face flushed with excitement. She ran to her father and took his hand and begged. "Dad! Dad! Can we go shopping first?" "Okay." Mr. Brown nodded excitedly at first, then looked up at Mrs. Brown with a sullen face, and cleared his throat. "Well, I mean, not yet. We have to go to Gringotts to exchange some money first. The currency of the Wizarding World and the British pound cannot be used interchangeably." "Oh." Chien also nodded with a sudden realization. The mother with a black face, the father who was off the line, and the super supportive sister, Austen didn't know where to complain, so he stood up and proposed. "That's it, Dad, Mom and I will go to Gringotts to exchange money. Dad, take Chien around to find out where all the things we want to buy are. We will meet here in half an hour." Mr. Brown first took a peek at his wife, and seeing her approving smile, he was relieved and agreed. "Yes, very good, I just thought so too." After that, the four parted ways, and the little guy, Chien, took his father's hand and jumped to the crowd. On the way to Gringotts, Mrs. Brown sighed and said, "OSS, you are always so sensible. I hope you can take good care of your sister when you get to Hogwarts." "My mother." Austen looked up at his mother and answered seriously. When they came to a snow-white building, the goblins in scarlet and gold uniforms in front of the bronze gate bowed to them and saluted. Even if Austen saw the goblins' calm face for the first time, Mrs. Brown's face was so calm. Very surprised. In fact, Austen has complained a million times in his heart. This goblin is really ugly, especially when it smiles and has big yellow teeth. It almost made him spit out the meal the night before. But at this time, his face was still expressionless, joking. If he showed disgust and made the goblins feel that you insulted him, that would be a very bad thing. They quickly entered Gringotts and saw the classic words on the silver inner door, "Come in, stranger, but beware of what will happen if you are insatiable, asking for nothing, and you will be punished the most severely. So if you wish to take from our underground vaults a fortune that was never yours, you have been warned, thief, that you will not bring treasure, but evil." Austen scoffed, the goblin's IQ wasn't that high, and no matter how heavily guarded it was, wasn't it also successful twice later? When they entered the Gringotts Hall, a goblin greeted them, and Mrs. Brown followed it to exchange money, leaving Austen to wait in the lounge area. The bored Austen picked up the Daily Prophet next to him and looked. There isn't much substance in the newspapers, other than a critique of the efficiency of the Ministry of Magic and a new book promoting Gilderoy Lockhart's embroidered pillow, both signed by Rita Skeeter. Austen, I deeply doubt that Rita Skeeter's jumping clown is definitely Lockhart's fan sister. Think goosebumps all over. Are you also a student at Hogwarts? A clear female voice asked Austen, who was reading the newspaper. Austen looked up and saw a little girl who looked about his age, with thick brown hair and a pair of front teeth. While Austen was still confused, the girl reached out to him. "Hello, my name is Hermione Granger." Austen's jaw dropped in surprise. There are surprises everywhere in life, and you can meet the protagonist everywhere. He was stunned for a while before he could react. He held Hermione's outstretched hand and responded. "Hello, Austen Brown. Freshman going to Hogwarts." "Ah, you are also a freshman." Hermione's tone was full of surprise. Austen nodded, "Well, yes, I came over with my family today to buy things for the start of school. Oh! Didn't Hogwarts send a teacher to guide you? My family didn't understand, so they sent the head of Gryffindor, Professor McGonagall, to help us, the McGonagall who signed at the end of the notice. Professor, do you know her? The girl said in a rowdy voice, with a proud face on her face. Oster looked helpless, nodded and said, yes, I know, my mother used to be her student, and I read every book my mother read when she was in school. Then your mother is also a wizard. Hermione was surprised, and when she saw Austen nod, she muttered in disappointment, that's great, our family are ordinary people who don't know how to magic, and even a guide can guide you. I don't have anyone. I'm sure I'll be last at Hogwarts. Austen really didn't want to see the girl get discouraged because of his casual words. He persuaded there's not much difference between kids from wizarding families and non-wizard families. My mom said that kids who went to regular schools were even smarter than kids who went straight to wizarding schools. Really? Hermione cheered up immediately. Yes, because the thinking patterns are different. Then have you also studied in an ordinary school? Yes, it's because my mother is afraid that I can't compare to children from ordinary families. Austen had no choice but to answer against his will. Haha, then I'm relieved. Hermione regained her confidence. Austen held his forehead secretly. Darling, talking to this girl is so tiring. The two little guys chatted for a while, and Mrs. Brown came to them after changing the money. Austen also saw a witch who came with Mrs. Brown. She was wearing an emerald green wizard's robe and a large black pointed hat on her head, with a serious look on her face. She was followed by a muggle couple dressed as normal people. After reaching them, Mrs. Brown shook hands with the witch and said, Professor McGonagall, I remember what you said, and I will pay attention. Professor McGonagall and the Granger family were going to buy a wizard robe for Hermione, and the Austens were going to reunite with their families, so they said goodbye at Gringotts. Frequently look back at Austen. Austen was also very remorseful. He talked too much with this girl. If there was anything she didn't understand, she would immediately become a nuisance. Austen and the others waited for a while until the father and daughter, who were having a good time, met at the back wall of the leaky cauldron. Sissy was sweating profusely, and her red face was full of smiles. She twittered to Austen, do you know that there are a lot of beautiful owls in the pet store over there? Dad said that he would buy one for me later. Do you want one too? There is also a broom shop, which has brooms that you can ride and fly. Oh! Don't you want one? It's a pity that brooms are not allowed to go to school in the first grade. Is there any kind of broom that can be folded up and sneaked in? Hey, little girl, your thinking is very dangerous. Austen said in his heart, this girl is not the one who can stop at first sight. He touched Qianqian's little head and comforted him, don't worry, you will have one sooner or later. It's fine in the second grade. If you do anything against the school rules, you will be kicked out of Hogwarts. This sentence made Sissy, who had been hooking on Mr. Brown with her resentful eyes, immediately became discouraged. Making Mr. Brown almost laugh, he looked at his watch and said to Mrs. Brown, it's 12 o'clock. It seems that there is nothing to buy in the morning. Let's go to Ollivander to buy wands for the children, and then go to the Leaky Cauldron bar for lunch. The rest will come and buy in the afternoon. Mrs. Brown agreed, and the group walked towards Ollivander's wand shop not far away. Ollivander is a small and run-down shop. As far as Austen knows, it is also the only wand shop in the UK, and there are only 3 in the whole of Europe, so the business is evident. It was noon, and there were not many people who came to buy wands. As soon as a wizard and a little boy left, it was Austen and Sissy's turn. Mrs. Brown walked up to her and shook hands with Mr. Ollivander enthusiastically. Hello, Mr. Ollivander, I'm Daisy Brown, and I bought my wand from you 25 years ago. The old Mr. Ollivander looked at the wand in her hand with a look of nostalgia, and said with a smile, mahogany, mere man hair at the core, 10 3/4 of an inch long, it's a very bouncy wand, but you bought it as daisy black, I'm right. Yes, Mr. Ollivander, now I'm bringing my children to buy their wands. Mrs. Brown said, patting Sissy on the shoulder. Qian's blushing little face lightened a lot, she held her hands together and circled her 2 index fingers around, looking very nervous. She stepped forward and looked up at Ollivander's white, almost pupilless eyes. Friendly extended his hand and said timidly, "Hello, Mr. Ollivander, my name is Sissy Brown, come and buy my wand." Mr. Ollivander shook hands with Sissy cordially, then with a wave of his hand, the tape measure that had just measured the little boy in front came over automatically and measured beside Sissy. After measuring all the odd distances, Ollivander smiled at her and took out a slender box from the shelf full of wands. He opened the box to reveal a black wand, more than brown. Madam's wand is slightly longer. Black willow, with dragon feathers at the core, 12 inches long, it's a good wand for casting spells. Mr. Ollivander put the wand into Sissy's hand and urged, "Try it now." Sissy held the wand and felt her hands were getting hot. The magic power in her body passed through the wand and reached the tip of the wand. She stretched out the wand and said, "Fluorescent flashing." The stars on the tip of the stick lit up, gradually getting brighter and brighter. The light wave swept through every part of the hut, slamming and dazzling. Both Austin and the Browns covered their eyes, and only Ollivander opened his mouth and opened his eyes wide, looking at Sissy and the wand in her hand in astonishment. After a while, the magic power that Qian gathered gradually dissipated, and the light became weaker and weaker, and finally annihilated. Sissy seemed to have collapsed, gasping for breath, her hand still clenching her wand tightly. He looked at Austin with a look of joy. Austin also smiled and nodded. After receiving the notice from Hogwarts, Austin secretly taught Sissy a few spells he learned from his mother's old books. It was between the two of them. Little secret. I didn't expect that Qian's first spell would be so successful. The bell on the door rang suddenly, and another little girl took the lead and ran in, shouting to the people behind her as she ran. "Mom and Dad, look, someone is casting a spell here." Austin looked at the prestige, and it wasn't Hermione who had been pestering him in the morning and who was running in. It was a big deal now, maybe both siblings would become her concern. "Although it's not written on the notice, I think you should know, Miss Brown, that students at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry are not allowed to perform magic outside the school." Professor McGonagall followed behind the Grangers and entered. Although she was still stern when she said this, Austin could clearly see the appreciation and approval in her eyes. Mr. Ollivander nodded to Professor McGonagall, then turned to Sissy. "Miss Brown, it looks like this wand is yours. Remember, you don't choose the wand, it's the wand that chooses the wizard." Qian nodded in understanding. Ollivander then looked at Austin. "It's your turn, Mr. Brown." Austin stepped forward and shook hands with Ollivander. Mr. Ollivander's silver pupils stared at Austin, his face almost touching Austin's. Austin pretended to be calm, and his heart was already beating drums. Could it be that Mr. Ollivander saw something? Mr. Brown, who was holding his wife's waist, also held his breath. Mrs. Brown felt her husband's nervousness and patted his hand lightly. The two smiled at each other, and Mr. Brown relaxed a lot. After a long time, Mr. Ollivander looked back and apologized to Austin. "I'm sorry, Mr. Brown Jr. I think I saw something. I hope it's my delusion. Let's take your measurements." Austin raised his heart that he had put down. He was afraid that his past experience would be known to others. A human being from another world might not be popular here either. Maybe there will be a relationship between someone with a heart and black magic. With a wave of Ollivander's hand, the same ruler came over to measure Austin's measurements, shoulder to fingertips, wrist to elbow, shoulder to floor, knee to armpit, and finally head circumference. Mr. Ollivander waved again, and the ruler automatically returned to his hand. He looked at the ruler and thought for a long time. Afterwards, he walked to the shelf where the wand was placed, picked up a box on the shelf, opened it, exposed the tip of the wand inside, shook his head, and put the wand back. He took out the wand in another box and looked at it, and put it back. Look at 16 or 7 wands like this. Every time he changed one, Austin's heart skipped a beat. After taking more than 30 wands in a row, Ollivander finally stopped taking new wands. He returned to them with an embarrassed expression. He opened his mouth to say something, but still didn't say it. He asked Professor McGonagall. He waved, motioning for her to come over. The two went to a corner not far away and whispered something. Seeing this, Austin's heart beat again, and the Browns were all nervous, looking forward to the two in the corner. Suddenly, Professor McGonagall's voice was an octave higher. What? You said Mr. Brown was a squib. Austin's heart jumped up, and it seemed that Ollivander knew about things that had no magic power. Hermione on the side was still puzzled, and Mr. Brown quietly clenched Mrs. Brown's hand, as if she was about to cry at any moment. Impossible, there is absolutely no mistake in the Hogwarts quill pen, you must have read it wrong. Professor McGonagall retorted with disbelief. Ollivander also said with an embarrassed expression. But I don't have Mr. Brown's wand here. This sounded like a thunderclap in Mr. Brown's ears. Back then, he didn't believe he was a squib and heard the same thing when he secretly came to Mr. Ollivander's wand shop to buy a wand. Now this sentence hits his heart like a spell. Professor McGonagall still didn't believe that Hogwarts could go wrong, and also called for Ollivander to take out every wand in the store for Alston to try. In the face of the powerful Professor McGonagall, Ollivander had already started to stutter, and letting him explain Professor McGonagall would be unrelenting. Austin's face was red and white. Maybe he should not have listened to the letter in the first place. He has never seen a wizard without a wand who can be called a wizard, even as powerful as Voldemort, before the decisive battle. Find a way to get a good wand. And Ollivander's words seemed to have sentenced him to death. After a long stalemate, he stood up and said to Professor McGonagall, Professor, thank you, I think it's really the quill that made a mistake. I have no magic since I was a child, and my family knows about it. I received a letter from Hogwarts by accident. I don't want to complain, but please allow me to drop out now. I don't think there's anything wrong with living like a normal muggle. Before Professor McGonagall could say anything, Mr. Brown trembled and hugged his son. I'm sorry, Dad shouldn't put so much pressure on you and make you so embarrassed. My dear, let's go home together after buying something for my sister. Dad supports you to go to ordinary school, you don't have to do it for mine. Regret and forced myself. Mr. Brown said finally, his voice gradually choked up. Professor McGonagall walked up to the hugging father and son, her face full of sympathy. She said to Mr. Brown, I'm very sorry for what happened to you in the past, but please believe that the name of your son, Mr. Alston Brown, is indeed on the Hogwarts freshman roster, and I do not accept any doubt. As for the lack of a wand, I will write to Mr. Albus Dumbledore, the headmaster of Hogwarts, with an owl later, and please believe that there is no problem that he cannot solve. Then she glanced at Hermione, who was still confused, and the Grangers, who looked puzzled, and said to Mr. Brown, now, please move to the leaky cauldron and wait for a while. After I and Miss Granger have bought the wand, I will go there to meet you. Mr. Brown let go of the hand that held his son tightly, and Professor McGonagall's words made him see the light again. He stood up, shook hands with Professor McGonagall, thanked Mrs. Brown, counted 7 galleons from the money bag and gave them to Mr. Ollivander, then took the family out of Ollivander's wand shop. Along the way, you read www.youcanshoe. No one in the family said anything, and Sissy lost the joy of buying the wand just now. She took Austin's hand gently and kept looking up at him, and she could see that she felt sorry for her brother. Austin, who felt her sympathetic gaze, pulled out a difficult smile and said to her, be happy, Sissy, we'll go buy an owl after lunch. I must pick the most beautiful owl for you. Qian also nodded in agreement, but there was no trace of joy on her face. After being silent for a long time, as if she had made a decision, she said to Austen. If you can't get into Hogwarts, then I'm not going either. Anyway, don't you always say that the Dark Lord will come back sooner or later? Don't you want me to go to Hogwarts? If you can't be a wizard, let's be muggles together. Austen didn't expect Sissy to think like this. It is impossible not to be moved. He held back the tears in his eyes, rubbed Sissy's golden head with a smile and retorted. Who came to harass me every day before going to bed, who waited for the owl every day, and said he didn't want to go to Hogwarts? Sissy's face flushed slightly, and she swept away Austen's hand. I was young then, who didn't have two embarrassing things when they were young, and now I'm 11 years old. Besides, didn't you always tell your parents how dangerous Hogwarts is? We don't go there. Isn't the ghost school away from danger? Austen sighed. He stopped, supported Sissy's shoulders, lowered his head slightly, looked at his sister who was half a head shorter than him and said firmly. Sissy, my sister, do whatever you want to do, no matter if I'm a wizard, a squib, or a muggle, I will definitely protect your safety, even if it costs my life. The family went to the Leaky Cauldron and found a random clean place to sit down. Mr. Brown went to order food, Mrs. Brown chatted with Austen, and Sissy fiddled with her wand. Don't be discouraged by Austen, even if you can't become a wizard, you can be as successful as your father. Even if you don't know magic, you are still charming. Mrs. Brown looked at her husband's back with great longing. Don't worry, Mom, I'm not sad, it suits me so well, I can follow in Dad's footsteps and continue to live my ordinary life. Mr. Brown came back with a plate of chips and quipped as if he caught them talking bad about themselves. What did you say behind my back? Say you're very successful, Dad. Austen said sincerely, looking into his dad's eyes. Before the items they ordered were ready, Professor McGonagall and his party came out from the back door of the Leaky Cauldron. Hermione stared at Austen as soon as she entered the door, looking like she was asking for evidence. If her mother hadn't held her hand, she would have rushed over already. Professor McGonagall walked directly towards the table of Austen and the others. She glanced around, and then whispered something in Mrs. Brown's ear. Mrs. Brown nodded with an unpleasant expression and said to Professor McGonagall. Thank you, Professor McGonagall, for your trouble. Then Professor McGonagall glanced at Austen with apologetic eyes, got up and left, and went to the table of the Granger family. Sissy hurriedly stepped forward to ask her mother, Mom, what did the professor say? Did the headmaster of Hogwarts reply? Mrs. Brown waved to Austen and took him to a pillar far away from the crowd. Seeing that his mother was not looking very well, Austen's psychology became clear. Said Mrs. Brown in a low voice, Austen, Professor McGonagall is here to apologize. She said that Albus Dumbledore did not expect this matter. Professor Dumbledore needs some time to solve this problem, and it will be done before 10 days before the start of school. Inform us. Austen nodded and said nothing. Go straight back to his seat. Sissy still reluctantly asked Austen what Professor McGonagall said to her mother. Mom patted her little head lightly and said, Baby, it's not the right place to talk about this topic. I'll tell you when I get home. Eat quickly. We'll have a lot of things to buy later. Curious baby Qian still wanted to ask more questions, but the topic was not suitable for discussion here. It was obviously related to her brother, so she obediently shut up. Austen looked at the pies and puddings that were just served on the table. He had no appetite. He apologized to his family and left his seat. Hermione, who had been staring at Austen, saw that he left without eating anything. She picked up 2 cheesecakes on the table and said something to her mother, and then followed. Austen went out the door of the Leaky Cauldron and sat in a daze on the bench outside the record store. To be honest, he was very uncomfortable right now. Not long after he was born in this world, he knew that his mother was a wizard. There was an indescribable excitement. But later found out that he did not have magic, which made him depressed a lot. Just after he had accepted his fate for so many years, Hogwarts came with a notice. The family came to Diagon Alley with great anticipation to purchase, but this happened. It made Austen deeply feel that he had been fooled. His mood was still a trivial matter. He deeply knew how much Mr. Brown expected him to study at Hogwarts. Although the Browns never mentioned it in front of their brothers and sisters, he and Sissy both guessed that their family was cut off from the magic world, and they never even walked around with their relatives because their father was a squib, which was the shackle that bound him for half his life, and now Austen was going to let him down again. It's not a blessing for Sai Wang to lose his horse. Austen laughed at himself. Who knows if it's a good thing not to be able to enter Hogwarts, maybe he just avoided the cruel Dark Lord like this. When he thought of Voldemort, Austen was a little worried about Sissy, that little girl's temperament might get entangled with the savior Harry Potter. No, even if he was just a squib, he must find a way to protect Sissy. Hermione also followed Austen out of the door of the Leaky Cauldron. She looked around at the door and saw Austen on the bench next to her. She also sat down on the bench next to Austen, gave him the cake in her hand, smiled brightly at him. Although I don't know what the squib means, I guess you must be feeling bad right now. When you're feeling bad, you have to eat enough to have the strength to be happy. Austen's black eyes looked at Hermione, one of the three protagonists in the future, with tousled hair and a little freckles on her face. Her front teeth looked bigger against the surrounding baby teeth, and she couldn't see her in the future. There is also an amazing side. Austen took the cake and forced a smile. Thank you, you are so kind. Hermione blushed slightly, bit the cheesecake in her hand, and silently accompanied him on the bench. In the afternoon, the Browns wanted to buy the rest of the things for Sissy. Austen insisted not to buy his share. He expressed that he wanted to stay at the Leaky Cauldron and wait for them. Thinking of what happened in Ollivander in the morning, the Browns didn't force him, and gave him a few galleons to take care of himself. The Granger family had already bought Hermione's wizard robes and wands in the morning, and she could buy the rest even if she didn't go. She also expressed that she was tired of shopping and wanted to stay at the Leaky Cauldron and wait for them. Mr. Granger's face was full of disbelief. After receiving the Hogwarts notice, she was the most excited in the family, and now she has voluntarily given up visiting Magic Street. In the end, the Grangers went to Diagon Alley with the Browns. Hermione, who was left at the Leaky Cauldron, still sat quietly beside Austen as at noon. Austen was also very helpless. The little girl decided that he was very sad now, and he had clearly adjusted his mood. Now it's like he needs comfort a lot, and she obviously doesn't know how to comfort people. It's embarrassing to sit like this, ma'am. Austen thought to himself. Yu reading www.yuyugonshu.com. After a long silence, Austen spoke first. Where's your wand? Hermione was taken aback by his question. Wand? In the pocket, what's wrong? Austen winked at her mischievously. Don't want to try your new wand. But I don't know any spells. Hermione touched her pocket crampedly, suddenly thinking of the dazzling light she saw in front of Ollivander's front door and window. She raised her head suddenly, and asked in surprise, is it true? Say, you will. Austen smiled meaningfully. Instead of answering directly, he just said guess what? Throughout the afternoon, the two began a magical exchange. No, Animagus doesn't want to change anything, it can only change into an animal, and once the form of Animagus is discovered, it won't be able to hide itself. This is Austen's voice. Even more exaggerated, Hermione sat in the small chair and looked at Austen with admiration, while taking notes quickly in her hands. Actually, when you practice Animagus, people may become obsessed. For example, if you try to become a bird and fail to succeed, it is very likely that some parts of your body will not change back, maybe your hand will become a bird's paw. Hermione frowned and grinned, obviously imagining something bad. Austin continued, so the Ministry of Magic has strict control over it, requiring that all animagus creatures and traits must be registered with the Ministry of Magic's Office of Misuse of Magic, and by the way, so is the witch, Professor Minerva McGonagall, who meets your family. An animagus, her animagus form is a cat. Oh. No. It's not Wingardium Leviosa, it's Wingardium Leviosa, and the word plus has to be long and clear. Do you understand? Austin corrected. Hermione nodded understandingly, then tried again. She stretched out her wand hand and pointed the tip of the wand at the goblet on the table. No, no, Austin frowned, took Hermione's hand holding the wand, and moved it down slightly. You have to point the wand under the object to feel like you have to hold it up, and then talk to me. Read Wingardium Leviosa. Austin's hand slammed over, and Hermione's nervous ears turned red. She stumbled and said, You. Wingardium, Leviosa. No way, how can the cup float when you recite the spell like this? Austin felt annoyed that I might have encountered a fake Hermione. Where is the smart and confident Hermione in the original book? He let go of Hermione's hand and looked back at her, only to find the little girl's blushing face. He was also cramped in an instant, and suddenly found the scene very embarrassing. In order to ease the atmosphere, Austin glanced at her quietly, and joked deliberately. Aren't you shy? He was waiting for the strong Hermione to give him a few words, saying that he was being affectionate or something, but the little girl lowered her head, and the redness on her face spread directly to her neck. Austin was even more at a loss then. Do you still want to practice? The little girl just remembered what she was going to do. She raised her head suddenly and responded. Certainly. Then just try again as I said. Austin ordered. Hermione tidied herself up, held her wand again, pointed the tip of the wand at the base of the goblet, and called out Wingardium Leviosa. As soon as the voice fell, the goblet gradually left the table, and the tip of her wand climbed up little by little until it was as high as Austin's head. Hermione blushed again, this time excited. She jumped up from the chair, hugged Austin suddenly, and shouted excitedly, I succeeded! I succeeded! Austin! I succeeded! The joy of the little girl's success in casting the spell for the first time hit Austin. He hugged Hermione back and patted her on the back excitedly. Yes! You succeeded! You are amazing! The two children embraced each other in joy, and no one cared about the goblet that was still floating. After the glass floated in the air for a while, it fell to the ground with a smack. The crisp sound of the goblet attracted people in the whole bar. Although it was past lunchtime, there were still a few people in the bar enjoying their afternoon tea. Several people's eyes were fixed on the two of them, and the sound of the goblet breaking also startled Austin and Hermione. The two let go of their hands and hurriedly apologized to the people around them. Everyone looked at them happily and nodded. Austin and Hermione were relieved. Austin went to the front desk of the bar to talk to Tom about the broken glass, and Hermione was left in place. She remembered the scene of hugging Austin just now, rubbing the corners of her clothes with her hands, biting her lips with her teeth, and her face that had just faded turned red again. Austin insisted on paying Mr. Tom a silver seco, but in exchange for Mr. Tom's greater kindness 2 crushed almond ice creams. He returned to his seat with 2 ice creams and gave Hermione 1. Later, Hermione tried a lot of spells, including the luminescence spell that Austin had taught Sissy, the sweeping spell to pick up the goblets on the ground, the disarming charm, the transfiguration charm, etc. Until Hermione finally waved her wand and pressed the newly removed table leg up. The Browns and Grangers also entered through the back door at the same time. Miss Granger, you must have missed what I said just now. Hogwarts does not allow students to perform magic outside the school. And you, Mr. Brown, please abide by the rules of the school. If you are divided into houses now, I will definitely deduct 10 points for your academy. Professor McGonagall's serious face stiffened. Austin quietly stuck out his tongue to Hermione, and Hermione also winked at him secretly. Professor McGonagall glanced at the clock on the wall and suddenly panicked. She hurriedly said goodbye to Mrs. Granger and Mrs. Brown. Oh! Merlin's beard! It's so late. I'm so sorry, I made an appointment with Professor Sprout to talk about something. Can I ask you to send the Grangers home, Daisy? Mrs. Brown smiled and nodded in response. Okay, Professor McGonagall, I will send them back safely. Thank you, Daisy, you're always so kind. Professor McGonagall took Mrs. Brown's hand and thanked him, and she turned to Tom, the owner of the leaky cauldron, and said to him, Good afternoon, Tom, can you lend me a fireplace? Use it, I hope I won't be late. The hunchbacked Tom grinned, showing his yellow teeth, and he stretched out his arm to show Professor McGonagall the way. Okay, Professor McGonagall, please come with me. Professor McGonagall took 2 steps forward, then turned around and winked at Austen. Be patient, Mr. Brown, there will be good news. Austen nodded politely and thanked Professor McGonagall. Professor McGonagall also nodded, then hurriedly followed Tom. Mr. Granger and Mr. Brown were left to discuss the way home. Mr. Granger complained that it was too late and they couldn't get back to Manchester tonight in the fastest car. The Hermiones are also in Manchester, and the Browns are in the south and the north. In this way, it's better, Mr. Brown suggested that they use the Flo network to go back, and then take the Manchester City intercity bus home after arriving at Brown's house. Mr. Granger was very embarrassed to accept it. Mrs. Brown stopped Tom, who had just sent Professor McGonagall away, and asked him to borrow a fireplace. Tom still said kindly, No problem, Mrs. Brown, please come with me. Tom took them to the second floor, and Yu reading www.yuyuganshu.com entered the first room on the left. Then he closed the door and walked out. Mrs. Brown took out a larger dragon skin bag from the handbag with the stretch spell, and opened the bag to reveal the blue powder inside. Although Austen and Sissy grew up in a wizard family, they had never used this kind of travel method used by wizards. Sissy's little hand was restlessly pulling at Austen's clothes, and Austen also traveled from he had seen the usage of Flo powder in the original book, and to be honest, it kind of made him terrified. Mrs. Brown motioned for Mr. Brown to demonstrate first. Mr. Brown grabbed a handful of Flo powder, went to the fireplace, sprinkled the Flo powder in his hand, and immediately a blue flame ignited under his feet. Mindu was shocked by the flames, and Chien took a step back in fear. Mr. Brown shouted out 36 Low Lilac Street, North Manchester, before he disappeared with the flames. Mr. Granger's mouth widened in surprise. Mrs. Brown explained. This fireplace and the fireplace in our house are both connected to the Flo network. As long as the address of our house is called out correctly after the Flo powder is sprinkled, it can be teleported immediately. Because of its convenience and speed, this has become a frequent occurrence of wizards. The way of travel. Immediately afterwards, Sissy, Mr. Granger, and Mrs. Granger each grabbed a handful of Flo powder, walked into the fireplace and disappeared. In the end, only Mrs. Brown, Hermione, and Austen were left in the room. Austen also grabbed a handful of Flo powder from the dragon skin bag in Mrs. Brown's hand and walked into the fireplace. He sprinkled Flo powder, and the blue flames rose up, and he shouted loudly North Manchester, 36 Short Lilac Street. However, after a few seconds, he was still there, the flames through his body were still blazing. Austen was confused. Is there such an operation? Mrs. Brown and Hermione were also stunned. Austen grabbed another handful of Flo powder and threw it under his feet, calling out the address of his home. The flames were higher than before, but the others remained motionless. Is there something wrong with the fireplace? Mrs. Brown murmured suspiciously. Then she handed the bag in her hand to Hermione, grabbed a handful of Flo powder, and tried to see if it was a problem with the fireplace. When Austen walked off the fireplace, she also went in, threw the Flo powder under her feet, called out the location of the house, and disappeared in an instant. Austin was also puzzled. Why is he the only one who can't use flow powder? Is there a little elf who is playing tricks on him like he's blocking platform 9 3/4 for Harry? Compared to Austin's doubts, Hermione's face was full of worry. Now that Mrs. Brown has disappeared too, what if only their 2 children remain here? She looked at the flow powder in her hand, then at the fireplace. It's not that she can't go back with flow powder, but there's absolutely nothing she can do to leave Austin here alone. Thinking of this, she tied the bag containing the flow powder and said firmly to Austin. Austin, we're the only ones left here, but don't worry, I won't leave you. You wait here, and I'll ask Mr. Tom if we can stay here for one night, and then go to Ancient Town tomorrow morning. Ling Court exchange galleons for British pounds and take the earliest train back to Manchester. Austin's thoughts were interrupted by her words. Apparently the smart and reliable Hermione was back again. Austin smiled rather moved. Thank you, Hermione, but I don't think we need to do that. Austin knew that the beloved Browns would not abandon their son. As soon as he finished speaking, with a bump, Mrs. Brown and Mr. Brown appeared holding hands. Hermione couldn't close her mouth in surprise. Mrs. Brown, this is apparition, child, you can use it when you're in 7th grade after you take the test. Mrs. Brown kindly answered Hermione's question. Mr. Brown took 2 quick steps, bent down and held Austin's tender shoulders, and his voice was full of concern. What's the matter, Austin? Austin couldn't answer either, he faltered and said that he couldn't use the flow network. Before Mr. Brown could express his doubts, Mrs. Brown instructed her husband. It seems that Austin can't use the flow network to go back today. It's too late. Alger, you should take Miss Granger to use the flow network first. Mr. and Mrs. Granger will also be worried. I just apparate back with Austin. Mr. Brown glanced at Austin worriedly, patted him on the shoulder and instructed. Austin, you must hold your mother and never let go. Do you know? Mrs. Brown stared at Mr. Brown with a displeased face and said, you can't even trust me, Alger. How could I not believe you? It's just that Austin is too small and apparition is so dangerous. Mr. Brown explained. Okay, let's go, I promise, you will bring your son back intact. Mrs. Brown urged them. Mr. Brown reluctantly grabbed a handful of flow powder, pulled Hermione, and walked towards the fireplace. Both of them turned their heads 3 times. Hermione's big eyes were filled with worry. Austin waved to her mischievously. After the 2 left, Mrs. Brown breathed a sigh of relief. She bent down and hugged Austin. Come on, baby, let your mother hold you and see what your father is worried about. If I pull you back, your father will definitely lose his temper with me. Austin, who was suddenly picked up by Mrs. Brown, was shy for a while. He had rejected his mother's hug since he was a child. After all, he had the heart of an adult. He was always kissed and hugged by a woman. It's really embarrassing. Mrs. Brown instructed, hold my neck, we're going. Apparition is not a joke, it might be fatal. Austin hugged his mother's neck obediently, closed his eyes tightly and prepared. When the mother and son were ready, Mrs. Brown disappeared with a bang in an instant. And Austin, that's right, was perpendicular to the ground and fell directly to the 2nd floor of the leaky cauldron. If it wasn't for the one who apparat was his own mother, he would really have cursed her. It's better to pull me, it won't fall so badly. Within a few seconds before he had time to get up, Mrs. Brown appeared out of nowhere. She seemed a little panicked and said while pulling up Austin, who was still lying on the ground. Tomorrow I must go to the Ministry of Magic to see who is making such a silly joke. Flow can't be used, and even apparition is restricted. Austin considers himself not that big of an influence, and in the 11 years he's been unremarkable, he's only seen Mrs. Brown as a wizard, and if it weren't for the old magic books from his mother in the bookcase, he wouldn't even dare to believe that you really live in a magical world. Since he received the notice from Hogwarts, bad luck seems to have been following him. First was the shameful thing that happened in Ollivander because he couldn't use magic, now he was a squib like his father, but couldn't even use flua and apparition. Suddenly, he suddenly raised his head as if thinking of something. Seeing his expression, Mrs. Brown thought he had a clue. Give him a questioning look. Austin looked down at the shoes in a flat tone and said, Mom, my shoes are stained with flua powder, can you cast a cleaning spell on me? Originally thought her smart son understood something, Mrs. Brown shook her head in disappointment. With a flick of her wand, she cast a cleansing spell, and the light wave swept across Austin's shoes. However, nothing has changed. The blue powder on the shoes remained untouched. A light of surprise appeared on Austin's face, which was exactly as he had guessed. Mrs. Brown was a little unconvinced. Even when she was just 11 years old, her magic had never been ineffective. Unwilling to admit defeat, she pointed her wand at Austin's shoes again, focused her attention, and said in her mouth, www.uyugonshoe.com clean up. This time, a huge wave of light emanated from the tip of Mrs. Brown's wand, swept from Austin's feet all the way down to his waist, to the top of his head. However, as Austin thought, the powder on the shoes remained the same. Mrs. Brown withdrew her hand, looked at the wand in her hand in confusion, and said to herself, it doesn't make sense, how could even my magic fail? Immediately, she stretched out her wand and turned around, casting a flaming fire spell on the fireplace. A flame burst into the fireplace immediately. Austin's excited voice trembled, he reminded Mrs. Brown, Mom, there's nothing wrong with your magic. Don't you see something? Mrs. Brown turned her head and stared at Austin's shoes suspiciously. Suddenly she showed an unbelievable expression and looked into Austin's black eyes. You mean, magic doesn't work for you? Austin nodded vigorously, the joy on his face became more obvious, he folded his hands towards himself, then opened his arms, and suggested, Mom, try casting a curse on me again. Mrs. Brown couldn't believe it, she took out her wand tremblingly, pointed the tip of the wand at Austin, and shouted. All petrified. She chose a spell with a safety point. Even if it worked, it would not have any adverse effect on Austin, and she could recover immediately. However, the phenomenon that Austin was petrified and fell to the ground did not appear, and he beckoned and winked at Mrs. Brown mischievously. Now Mrs. Brown really believed that although her son couldn't use magic, he was immune to the spells others cast on him. I am afraid that there is no second such person in the entire wizarding world.